Welcome, welcome. Sorry about the problems we had getting the screening started. We had to juggle between a San Francisco company, YouTube, and our local PBS. But now finally, here we are for a discussion on Benjamin Franklin, a compelling founding father, inventor, diplomat, printer, publisher, and ladies' man who definitely changed our world. I'm your host, James Floss, lecturer emeritus from Cal Poly Humboldt and a longtime theater artist. And with us, our panel includes Cal Poly Humboldt history professor, Dr. Thomas Mays, Chico State University history professor, Dr. Eran Zelnik, and retired science teacher and homework hotline instructor, Ken Pinkerton. Welcome, gentlemen. And now would you each please, in turn, just give your a concise introduction of how you interact with Benjamin Franklin in your professional lives. Tom?
I teach early American history at Cal Poly, and Franklin has been an integral part of what I teach. And every semester I'm teaching American history for freshmen, I have his autobiography assigned, and I find a new way to look at him every year.
And Eran?
Thanks. Yeah, my interest is in early American history, of course, but also specifically my research, my book project that I'm working on is on humor in early America, the Revolutionary period, early national period. And so Benjamin Franklin is, of course, a touchstone for a lot of that. If one wants to understand American humor, Benjamin Franklin is kind of the beginning.
King of the bromides. And Ken?
You're muted, Ken.
Hi, I'm Ken Pinkerton. I had the pleasure of a career teaching elementary and middle school in Humboldt County. Finished up at Zane. Right now in retirement, I'm a cheerleader for math, science, and engineering education, and try to get out there and do things. So through Homework Hotline, the Humboldt Math Festival, CR Science Night, and anywhere else I can be involved.
Okay, to each of you, I want to like maybe 3 adjectives. When you hear the name Benjamin Franklin, what do you immediately think of?
Conflicted.
Witty.
Witty.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Ron?
Witty, yeah. I think of him as a man of wit, the first American wit, and that has created a truly American kind of wit, as opposed to British.
And now, did this documentary change your opinion of Benjamin Franklin? And if so, how? Anyone?
I was impressed of his complexity and his ability to change. That he was a loyalist, and but at the same time, worked very hard for the unity of the colonies. And then whenever the Revolutionary War came, he immediately became devoted to the Revolution and to America or the United States. And that he could go to France and be the same kind of ambassador that he was for the colonies to England.
Anyone else?
I really just appreciated the discussion of his slavery. I always knew that he owned a few slaves at some point, kind of as an abstraction, but to actually get some names, to get a little bit of a sense of the broader context of the kind of slaves he owned and what they how they figured in his life, just to have it a little bit more clear rather than an abstraction, I thought was very important. I've never actually heard any names associated. So that specific couple, for example, that were under him.
Mm-hmm. Tom, anything?
It did a great job of capturing the whole breadth in 4 hours of his work. The historians they had involved, like Ellis Brown, Brands, Dunbar. Bernard Balin has passed away. He is one of the deans of colonial American, early American history. I was reading his work in the early 80s. He's just absolutely brilliant. It was really a great collection of folks to bring in the whole complicated picture of Franklin's life together.
So he also was a writer and a publisher. He really worked on his writing all of his life. He worked to improve his writing, and he published newspapers. He Poor Richard's Almanac. How do you think that informed his evolution as a human being?
Well, I think what always strikes me is self-reflection and what goes into writing and rewriting, and how prolific he was. You know, in a very different age where you had to typeset everything, or just, you know, I think that's part of his brilliance too, is to be able to work through and come up with such profound things that Eran has mentioned, as far as all the sayings and things that are still very true today. My favorite is, you know, fish and visitors start to stink after 3 days is certainly true today as it was then, I think. So I'm just, his body of writing and work, not only for the people, but for the scientific writing, are just phenomenal.
I would say that I'm especially, of course, from my vantage point, especially interested in Poor Richard's Almanac, which is, of course, what really made him both rich and famous in the colonies over this period, over several decades, that he published one of the most successful and popular almanacs, and he really popularized himself as a kind of as an American wit, as a person, as a humorist of specifically American, American qualities, that is more interested in homespun and wit and kind of humor that is not necessarily highbrow, but is available to the masses, that doesn't try to kind of condescend over you, right? As many of the British wits would try to do, that doesn't assume all kinds of knowledge of Latin and all kinds of reference to a whole kind of long list of writers from from Milton to Pope to others. That's the kind of wit that was usually you'd hear in the British world. So he kind of really started this American tradition of homespun drawl sayings that drew more from stuff like Don Quixote than from kind of these wits of the British world that until then had kind of ruled the British world. So I especially think that it's hard to really overstate the significance of Poor Richard's Almanac and the sayings that were involved there, these droll, witty sayings that became so popular for Americans. And really, later on, he republished them as The Way to Wealth, which also became his bestseller, and really perhaps the most important text by Benjamin Franklin until many, many years after his death, when his autobiography was made available, because his autobiography was only made available several decades after his death. Until then, The Way to Wealth was really the most important document, which was a collection, basically, of his most famous sayings and adages from Poor Richard's Almanac.
Do you think people like Mark Twain and Garrison Keillor owe something to Benjamin Franklin?
Certainly, yeah, certainly. It's kind of part of that same tradition, right? Huckleberry Finn is kind of a nephew, if you will, to Poor Richard.
You know, in the first couple of chapters of his autobiography, I was struck by he mentions how many people never paid him, and then Poor Richard's Almanac, he finally really started to make a lot of money. The other thing I liked was he got really excited when he got a new set of type. It seems to me, at least here, I'm forgetting the name of the place we have here where they all wood crafts and the old style printing press. But as someone who did typography on a computer decades ago, I could understand his excitement of getting a new set of type and what that looked like and what he could do with it. What do you think of him as a scientist and inventor?
I think he was brilliant. So, as I've read more, I didn't realize how much of a foundational person he was on electricity. He came up with the concepts of positive and negative for electrical charges. The whole conductors and insulators was his invention too. The other thing that struck me was the amount of communication between Europe and he established all these contacts in Europe, and I think that's where he got excited or learned about the people who were kind of starting to investigate electricity.
And not everyone agreed with his work on electricity.
No, not at all. So it's especially the lightning rod. His invention of lightning rod was prohibited or fought against by a lot of religious folks because they thought lightning was the wrath of God and kind of a punishment for your sins, even though churches were the number one place that got hit by lightning in most communities. So
not something that could be harnessed and tamed.
No. So if your house got hit by lightning, that's because you were a sinner. So
why didn't he patent anything like the lightning rod? He wouldn't patent his inventions.
I know that's what was fascinating is that it might have just come from his humble beginnings. I mean, his dad was a soap maker, and I can't imagine a more tough career in those times too. Dealing with animal fat and lye was on a daily basis was a tough go, I think.
All right, Declaration of Independence. What are your thoughts on his involvement in the Declaration of Independence for the United States?
Well,
Anyone?
he was on a committee with Thomas Jefferson, who was brand spanking new to the Continental Congress. Brand spanking and never even stood up and said a word. He's, as we'd say, the FNG guy down there. But everybody knew Jefferson was a great pamphlet writer from his work in Virginia. So John Adams and Franklin were put in a committee together to write this declaration after Congress had voted on it. And they put Jefferson in charge of this thing. And one of the neatest things was Jefferson had the luck of having one of the finest editors in the English world edit the Declaration of Independence for him. And incredible things came out of that work.
Several times in his autobiography, he mentions Hamilton. That wasn't Alexander Hamilton, was it?
It's interesting because in the play, Franklin's name doesn't come up once.
Oh. When he mentions Hamilton in the autobiography, is that Alexander Hamilton?
I would have to look, but most likely.
Huh.
Although there's also at the time a pretty famous Baltimore Dr. Hamilton, so it might be in the 40s and 50s, if that was more the association. But in any event, as for the Declaration of Independence, what I think is to me really interesting is that the Declaration of Independence in many ways is a document that doesn't represent in its values and its ideas most of the founders. Really, it's far more radical a document than, say, the Constitution, and most of the founders felt like they could support it, but they did not necessarily support all the logical conclusions of some of the statements in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson certainly was one of the more radical ones, but I think that in this regard, Benjamin Franklin was also one of the more, he was, of course, of humble origins, and as opposed to, say, Alexander Hamilton, that was also of humble origins, he was proud of his humble origins. He was proud of where he came from, and he didn't attempt to become an elitist member of society or a kind of pseudo aristocracy in the same way that Alexander Hamilton did. And so I think that I'm not sure. It's hard to know exactly. We don't know exactly how much, what he edited and how much he edited, but the fact that he supported the document certainly didn't hurt, and helped kind of pass it through in its full radical language. I would assume, as the document, the founding document of the country that we still try to live up to. Often we fail to, but we still try to.
Okay, so he had quite a life journey from being a very strict Puritan to becoming a member of the Enlightenment. Any thoughts on that from anyone?
One of the fun questions I pose to my students is to take a look at Puritan America. And once again, these are people just a few years away from the Salem witch trials and predestination and all these beliefs that, God throws lightning bolts at church steeples, to Franklin and his enlightened view, and how he is highly influenced, especially with the Quakers in Pennsylvania and the Enlightenment itself. The dramatic shifts in his life are just fascinating to look at.
I'm personally really interested in also the transition into America that we know today, that Benjamin Franklin captures so well. And in this regard, he also captures that transition from Puritan culture to liberal capitalism. Interesting, it was actually Max Weber who first was onto this idea in his famous essay. What's the exact the spirit of the Puritan something and the spirit of capitalism, right? So the famous sociologist, German sociologist of the late 19th century, but in his famous treatise on it, he actually looked to Benjamin Franklin and saw in him the important linchpin between early Protestantism and capitalism, right? And he actually looked at Benjamin Franklin as perhaps the best example that we have of a person who captures in his Puritan dispositions the way in which these very dispositions ultimately lend themselves to a very liberal and capitalist frame of mind and set of dispositions. So in this way too, I think Benjamin Franklin was captured, right, what this nation has become, a very capitalist and liberal nation, right, in which the self-made man is the hallmark and the iconic kind of American to this day.
So we have a question from the peanut gallery that I think would fit in really well here. Guy Elaine Arnoff asks, how do we make Franklin relevant today? Do we have a Franklin around today? Do we have a modern counterpart that you think is as spectacular?
I don't know. I'm not a historian, but talking with kids about Franklin was just the connection that we have with how Franklin went to France to get them to back the revolution, indirectly taking the hatred of France towards England. And I think the parallels between the United States sending arms and money to the Ukraine right now is very similar, as far as it's an in-between war, as it were. And I don't know of anybody who's an influential or who is making those connections. The president of Ukraine certainly is an amazing man. Well
said, yeah.
But I thought that was an interesting parallel to what's happening right now.
And the inventor side, what about Elon Musk? Is he as burning as brightly as Benjamin Franklin did as far as that inventor side?
Yeah, he might be. I would be interesting to compare the love-hate that people have of Elon Musk to Franklin's contemporaries. At least,
Although I don't know that he's much of an inventor. He's more of a entrepreneur, more of a person who takes crazy risks.
yeah, kind of
Yeah,
Edison.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. It's an interesting question to think if there's anybody who could parallel, right, in the place the nation was at the time with right, this type of this type of context in which you could be a founder, right? It's kind of a very peculiar time. Maybe only during the Civil War we had other times that that were as influential or as formative.
And we have people during this period across the globe, like Alexander von Humboldt, who are just incredibly talented in so many different ways. Jefferson spoke and read, I think, 7 languages. Not only that, he was an inventor himself. Washington was one of the most talented scientific farmers in America, period. These guys went in 100 different ways. Today, people focus on, oh, I do Facebook. That's all I invented that. That's it. That's all I got.
Yeah. We'll move on. Right.
Okay, so let's talk about his moral code a little bit. How do you feel his moral code evolved throughout his lifetime, and his list of 12 virtues? I'll go over them quickly again: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and finally, modesty.
I personally think it once more kind of dovetails with the question about his Puritan origins, in that, but his ultimately liberal, even capitalist heritage, and in this regard, kind of these different ethical values are kind of an interesting combination of both Puritan dispositions or Puritan kind of notions that are certainly stem from this idea that you need to, right, live according to certain moral standards and constantly check yourself, constantly see if you are of the community of the elect, or hope that you might be of the community of the elect. This Puritan anxiety and attempt, but this, of course, is also what animates capitalists to always try to figure out ways to, right, to be more successful, to cut costs, to figure out new markets, to ensure that we are not more, we don't spend more than we make, right? So I think this is an interesting moment in between those two, right? The origins, these Puritan origins, and the capitalist heritage of Franklin.
We got another question from the peanut gallery. Robert asks, how influential was Franklin in getting the French to back the revolutionists? We know about Hamilton and Lafayette. Anyone?
Indispensable, absolutely indispensable. When the war began, the United States, not the United States, but the American colonies had always considered the Catholic French their greatest enemy. It was the Catholic French who stirred up the 7 Years' War with Native Americans from Canada. It was the Catholic French who threatened every Puritan in America. The Continental Congress put together a secret committee to go over there and deal with them. And they sent Franklin, as well as Silas Deane and several other people. Franklin was a rock and roll superstar. I have no other analogy for him. He was the most famous American on the planet. The French were falling in love with the Enlightenment and this idea that a common American with no noble birth, no higher education, no money behind him, could harness electricity, they absolutely loved him. His influence in the court, in the salons, everywhere in France was the key to it.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how big he was in France. Some even say that he was bigger in France than he was in the US, in terms of how popular he was. For example, when he died, there were more obituaries in France and more effusive, right, kind of outpouring of effusive um, kind of celebrations in his honor, or some kind of marking of his death than in the US. For example, during the revolution, the first song that the French revolutionaries sang before the Marseillaise became their anthem was Ça ira, which is actually a reference to a famous Franklin saying. That's how big he was. That's how important he was, right? They basically went to one of his famous adages that they once asked him, what's going to happen during the revolution? He said, Saira, let it happen, something along those lines. And that became there. So for the French, he was huge. And so I think that has to have played a role. Yeah.
He was bigger in France because of the longitude and latitude and the Earth's magnetic poles. He was actually a 16th of an inch taller in France. It's a joke.
Well, and then the fact that he knew his wife was ailing, and chose to stay in France rather than go home, speaks a lot.
Sorry, Thomas, I think I cut you off.
The French even gifted a war vessel to the United States, and guess what they named it? Poor Richard, Bonhomme Richard.
Ah.
Huh.
Okay, so we're going to go back now to his moral code. Chastity. What do you think of his various peccadillos and sexual embroglios?
Certainly we're there.
How do you think he could, in his life, come up with this moral code? And he had this little chart that he would,
Right.
mark off. Have I been chaste today? And yet he had this whole other life.
I was trying to look at that chart whenever they filmed it, and I didn't see the chastity line. So, but I suspect it would have had a lot of marks on it, from what I understand. So.
The whole thing is reprinted in his autobiography. But the way I see it is, what happens in Paris stays in Paris.
So no
Yeah.
juicy anecdotes about
Sounds
that.
right. Sounds right. But I think that's just goes to how conflicted a person he is, how contradictory a person he is, how contradictory most people are, really. And Franklin certainly was that. He was very, his autobiography might be kind of a interesting, right, an interesting interpretation of his life, but it was that we know him often, or that's how he's familiar to many of us. But it was a construction that was very far from the reality. Probably the reality was very, very different. And he's and we'll talk later on about slavery and Native Americans, and we'll see only I think we'll only further unpack the extent to which he was contradictory and full of just right, very all kinds of flaws.
In fact, that's coming up next on my list of questions, but we got another question come in from the peanut gallery. So let's go there before we get on to the whole slavery and racism question. Guy again asks, how do you suppose Franklin would approach the climate question today?
He would probably write some kind of, in fact, the satire, right? The satire that just came out would have probably, Don't Look Up would have probably been kind of it's a kind of a Franklinian document of sorts. In fact, maybe, in fact, if we have somebody who's a kind of a Franklinian figure, it's that that producer that makes all these all these shows these days. What's his name? Adam McKay or whatever about the
Ken
Big
Burns,
Short, right? He's kind of actually a Franklinian character in some regards.
Do you think he would reference climate in the Poor Richard's Almanac?
But its importance to farmers would certainly
Probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My father was a farmer and definitely used the almanac for planting and weaning cattle and everything else. So it was an important document.
So I'm hearing you say that he would starkly give the information in the almanac, but he would probably write satirical treatises and whatever in his own way.
Yeah.
I think that's a conjecture that's worthwhile thinking about. Okay, let's get to the big one now. We're still on to his moral code and the fact that he owned slaves originally, and then late in his life became an abolitionist. And he said whites who have slaves are enfeebled.
Right.
Do any of you have any kind of thoughts of this evolution of a human being over the course of a lifetime?
So many figures in American history really evolve in their views. If you look at Lincoln, for example, when he was debating Stephen Douglas in Southern Illinois, where most of the whites were Southerners from Kentucky, he had incredibly racist statements to say that no black should ever intermarry with whites, no black should ever vote, no black should ever be considered a political equal. And by the last speech he publicly gave before his assassination, he stated that those men who carried a rifle who are black have earned a complete and total right of citizenship and full citizenship. To see that evolution and Franklin's evolution, and actually Washington evolved and freed his slaves in his will. I wish he had done it before he became president, but there are people who could rise above the world they live in, and Franklin's one of them.
Well, even Barack Obama's, I think it was his attitude towards gay marriage and his evolution of ideas and acceptance. And so it's contemporaries right now. So it's,
I have to admit that I have kind of mixed feelings about this, because yes, on the one hand, we are inclined to kind of try to find this positive trajectory kind of in his development, but I also think that and to some degree it's certainly there, but to some degree I would also think that it's important to put that in the context a little bit like Erica Dunbar does actually in the documentary. And she basically suggests that Franklin is very much of his time in this regard. He doesn't really do anything that is out of really kind of outside what you might expect of a person in his position, meaning that he kind of he comes towards this position along the time that, as you said, George Washington is coming to this position, Thomas Jefferson is coming to this position. It's largely the American Revolution that makes, as Bernard Bailyn suggests, that makes this whole contradiction just impossible to keep up with, and the hypocrisy of the American Revolution just seems untenable given slavery. That really drives all these leaders towards their anti-slavery position. So I think in this regard, it's, certainly as he was on the right side of things, but he didn't do that in a way that was outside of the norm for people of his stature at the time. So in this regard, I don't know that we really should, should be that kind of effusive about it. Although certainly, I think maybe one thing though, that is the fact that he actually did send a petition to Congress is more than any other of the founders had done. Even Thomas Jefferson, for example, in his attempt in the Northwest Ordinance to ensure that slavery does not expand to the Northwest, although that didn't really even, and I don't want to say that Thomas Jefferson was any better on this regard, because he owned far, far more slaves and was more of a walking hypocritical contradiction than Franklin. But in this regard, I think actually, right, the extending, the actually making the petition and writing that that famous satire, I think that is something that maybe here Franklin was actually should be commended specifically for those things, in a way that really he went out of his way, it seemed, on his deathbed almost, to kind of try to make kind of his last big move seemed to have been quite a gesture in this regard. So I think that's the one thing that I would give him. I don't know that I would commend his personally. I just kind of have a hard time with it.
To paraphrase what I think all you're saying is that that was the arc of history at the time, not perhaps his own apotheosis or whatever, that it was the arc of history. Now, this next question I have is personal to me now. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and you know what just happened there. I had a sister-in-law who worked at a top supermarket for a very long time. I was really kind of dismayed when I heard him say that he was against immigrants of swarthy complexion, Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes. Are Swedes?
That's a
Swarthy?
Yeah. The swarthy Swedes are interesting always. Yeah,
So,
interesting.
you know, the term bandied about in the news a lot in these last few days is white supremacists. Does that have any parallel to what that statement he said about swarthy immigrants?
I mean, I think what's more, it's he was of his time in this regard, very much so. He wasn't, right. If we suggest that being anti-slavery to some degree was of his time, we should also say, by the same token, that being racist was very much of his time, and he was not a unique in any way. He would just basically said what everybody thought. What's perhaps a bit interesting is that he was actually willing to say most things out loud and try to work through some ideas out loud in ways that maybe some others did not necessarily, although Jefferson said kind of similar things, even were actually much worse things in his essay on Virginia. But yeah, but I think it was very much of his time, and that's how it should be viewed.
And I agree with Eran completely. And we should look at the time when he wrote that. He considered himself an Englishman. And he considered his English heritage, and he considered America to be a land of Englishmen.
And Reds, he said, and Reds.
And Reds, he did say that. He did say that, and that caught my ear. And that was pretty much the norm.
Well, apparently he was very, very impressed with the kind of governance he was seeing in the Native American tribes. Yeah. He was clearly impressed by that. And that had to somehow influence him in his work on the Declaration of Independence and the rest.
The inference that was made in a clip that we saw today, right before the 7 Years' War, at the Albany Conference, where Franklin was really pushing some type of unified government of 13 colonies, because prior to that, whenever there was a war with Canada or the French, especially the French and natives, one colony would find itself at war and the other colonies would just blow them off completely. They wanted some unified way to work with natives and to deal with this. And he saw, especially within the Mohawk and the tribes of upstate New York, a unity between them and a consensus to do things. And that was a fascinating insight he had to their culture. The Iroquois.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. The inspiration that he took from the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? It's really interesting, and really, if you think of it, it's kind of how how the United States ultimately, at least initially, kind of in the Continental Congress, kind of looked to some degree how the Albany plan, also, although it was never really carried out, how the Albany plan looked, right? It took inspiration from Native Americans. Yeah.
They kind of were certainly inspiring people like Franklin, who mentioned it in his work. But of course, there had been federal societies in Europe, and democracy is a Greek word. So you put all this together and we get something different.
Mhm.
We're going to reach some sort of conclusions here soon, but we have another question from the Peanut Gallery. Robert notes that Franklin was estranged from his loyalist son, the governor of New Jersey. Do you historians, do any of you know that were they ever able to reconcile?
Franklin did meet with his son after the war, when his son fled to England, and it was very cold. They never reconciled.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, his son became a loyalist, right? And so that was a big deal.
And was involved in military attacks against Americans. So Franklin took this very personally.
Well, one of his other sons, his youngest son, I guess, died of the smallpox. And I was really surprised to read in the autobiography that one of his, one mistake he thought he made was not to have his son inoculated. Well, that certainly rings true to our society today now, doesn't it?
The son was sick at the time, and he felt that if he was down when he got the inoculation, it's not a vaccination, it might have taken him out. But he was 100% pro-inoculation, as was George Washington. He lined up his whole army and shot these guys. You guys are going to get it. So to say forced inoculations or vaccinations are un-American is to say un-American.
Yeah, right. Okay. So some of the closing questions.
Actually, I'd like to say a few more things about Native Americans.
Sure.
Because certainly we, it was to some degree represented in the documentary how he was a contradiction also with regards to Native Americans, right? He, on the one hand, drew inspiration from Native Americans in the Plan of Albany. For example, he wrote one of the most fascinating and inspiring documents about against the attempts to, or the not attempts, the massacre of the Paxton by the Paxton boys of the Conestogas in Pennsylvania in 1763. In the winter of 1763, he wrote the most famous at the time kind of attack or castigation of those deeds in a language that is very, very, I think, inspiring in its ability to see over, to take kind of a broad view of things, and to suggest that just by killing people for the color of their skin is just kind of the most horrible atrocity, and that where basically he basically said that we're no better than the Turks or anybody else, right? All these people that we always condemn, we're no better than them, right? In these very, very harsh words. So in this regard, I think it's very he has some, right? It has a lot of stuff going in his credit, but also it's important to note that Benjamin Franklin is ultimately, maybe alongside Thomas Jefferson, the most important settler colonial ideologue, right? He is the person who explains away and legitimizes in many ways the type of the settlement and the colonial enterprise in America as it ultimately was carried out by Americans. This settlement in basically the ethnic cleansing of native peoples. Of course, he did not want that to happen. He hoped it would not happen, but it was never a high priority for him that it won't happen, right? The highest priority for him was settlement. And he actually a few times kind of intimated that he kind of assumes that Native Americans will go extinct. He said so various times. He said so maybe from alcohol that go extinct in his autobiography, and other places. He said in actually that the document they draw on in the documentary, he talks about how ultimately they will have to go extinct if we are to extend, right? So in this regard, right, he is, and he's also this important linchpin to Thomas Jefferson's idea of empire of liberty. This idea that we will create an empire that will tame the continent, but somehow we'll do that as an empire of liberty, right? This contradiction of terms, empire and liberty. And in any event, he's he also must be seen in that light. I think it's important for us, I think, to remember that as well.
So my last question is going to be about Ken Burns himself. But first, I'm not a historian. I have a keen interest in science, but I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist. What haven't I asked you that would allow you to talk about what you want to say about Benjamin Franklin before we go tonight?
I feel like I just spoke a bunch, so I'll let you guys start.
Well, I think he is a wonderful example of how a human being can change. That in so many of the things you look at, his actions and his deeds, and his attitudes towards slavery and so many other things. Those are mixed with his actions towards his family were definitely peculiar. But I think that his evolution as a human being through his life was extraordinary. So.
Another thing is kind of a role as a founder. I think it gets kind of lost. But when we think of people we look at in American history, we think of the George Washingtons and the people at the front. So many of the people who were so essential to the American Revolution never picked up a musket. Thomas Jefferson never did. John Adams never did. Franklin was both a diplomat and a politician. His keys and his connections with the French, bringing the French in, he's 100% responsible for that. And then when the war came to a conclusion, he authored basically on the side with the British, the peace treaty where the king recognized the United States. His role as a diplomat and as a representative of the United States just cannot be understated.
That's why he's on the $100 bill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that for me just captures so well the kind of the contradictions of America. And of all the founders in the most, I think, interesting and telling ways, because he's right, he was born poor. He became kind of this self-made man, such an American kind of iconic story, or that at least became iconic in America, or at least that's what Americans want to think of themselves. He's also one of the truly more radical folks of the founders, right? The founders, for the most part, were not that interested in creating a democracy. They were more interested in creating a pretty hierarchical republic. And Franklin, alongside Jefferson and certainly Thomas Paine, who Franklin was a good friend of, and was a mentor to some degree, were those that kind of during the revolution started this or gave to the revolution a more of its radical that vocabulary and its and instincts, and in this regard also I think he's right. He helped bring about a far more democratic nation than would have been than might have been otherwise if it just were left to folks like Hamilton and Washington, or John Adams. So I think also this, in terms of his culture, right? He captured that the kind of culture he fostered, this democratic, humble, folksy, right? This is ultimately what the United States became. This country that highlights this folksy origins, right? To this day, if you want to be kind of prototypically American, you have to be folksy to some degree. You have to be, you have to kind of be the common man in this way. You have to talk about how you created yourself. You weren't born to a well-to-do family or whatnot. Which would have been the more European thing to do. So in this regard, he's kind of the prototypical American more than any other founder.
Okay, since I'm a theater artist, I get to ask one little softball question. Today, who would you cast in the role of Benjamin Franklin? If a movie was made, a biopic. Any ideas?
Tommy Lee Jones would be really good. He was great in Lincoln. I forget which character he played. He was really good in that.
I need to think about it more. It's a good one.
Well, then,
let me see.
Paul Giamatti would be another one.
yeah, to go from Adams to Franklin.
Yeah, to Franklin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to finish up with this. Anyone who's not seen the entire nearly 4 hours, I would suggest you do. It's captivating. It's interesting. It's fascinating. But let's now open this up to more general Ken Burns type of question. Folks on my panel, what are some of your favorite Ken Burns documentaries? Oh, Robert says Gary Sinise would play a good Benjamin Franklin. What are some of your favorite Ken Burns documentaries and why?
There's not one that I dislike, but as an early American and Civil War historian, when he came out in 1990, Civil War, I still use that in my Civil War class. I will cover a topic and then let Ken do the visuals. And, I'll cover it in an hour and I've got another 20 minutes to cover. It's Ken's turn. All of his work on baseball is mind-blowing. If you're into baseball, if you're into the blues and jazz, his work is just fantastic. His work even on country music, which my parents always had listening and I always had in the background. It made me tear up every episode because I knew who all these people were. So all of his work, I just always can't wait till his next thing comes out.
Agreed.
I really like his Dust Bowl documentary. I think especially because to understand the Dust Bowl, you just have to sense it in this kind of in a way that you can do only with images. And so his ability to really harness imagery in the Dust Bowl, I think, is so powerful and so important to get it right. You watch it and you feel like you want to suffocate. Right. It's and that's how one should feel after thinking about the Dust Bowl.
Okay, we have another casting here, but just before we sign off here, Guy says, how about Tom Hanks?
Could see that.
Yeah, he's never made a bad film, I don't think.
So with that, Eran, Tom, and Ken, I want to thank you very much for being the voice of knowledge for this. I really appreciate your expertise you brought to this. I'm really glad that we had some questions from the people who joined us tonight. Again, I'm sorry it took us a little while to get off the ground tonight, but we did. We got there and it was very interesting. And I thank you all very much for participating in this. And remember, as Benjamin Franklin said, to succeed, jump as quickly at opportunities as you do at conclusions.
Thanks to Katie and
Thanks, James.
Dave for
Thanks,
putting
Katie.
it all together too.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.